His battery of 105mm guns sits protected beneath nearly 2 meters of steel-reinforced concrete, walls specifically engineered by the Todd organization to withstand direct hits from the largest naval shells in existence. For months, Richter and his comrades have been told these positions are impregnable, that the Atlantic Wall represents the greatest defensive fortification system ever constructed by mankind. In less than 3 hours, an American battleship lurking 17 kilometers offshore will prove that assessment catastrophically wrong, firing shells containing a secret so closely guarded that American commanders were ordered to ensure they never fell into enemy hands intact. What Richter does not know, what the entire German High Command has failed to anticipate, is that Allied scientists have spent 3 years perfecting a weapon that thinks for itself, a shell that knows exactly when to detonate for maximum devastation. This is the story of how a tiny radio transmitter changed the mathematics of warfare forever. If you enjoy content that reveals the hidden technologies that shaped history, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from today. The seeds of this revolutionary weapon were planted not on the beaches of France, but in the laboratories of the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. The year was 1940, and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign had demonstrated a terrifying reality. Conventional anti-aircraft shells were almost useless against fast-moving aircraft. The mathematics were brutal. A shell fired at a bomber flying at 300 kilometers per hour had to be timed perfectly to detonate within 9 meters of the target to cause significant damage. Even the most skilled gun crews achieved hit rates of less than 1%. For every aircraft destroyed, thousands of shells were expended, an unsustainable equation that threatened to hand air superiority to the Axis powers permanently. The problem was fundamentally one of timing. Traditional shells used mechanical time fuses, tiny clockwork mechanisms that detonated the explosive charge after a preset number of seconds. Gunners had to estimate the altitude, speed, and direction of an incoming aircraft, calculate the shell's flight time, and set the fuse accordingly, all within seconds while under attack. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second, and human beings simply could not perform these calculations with sufficient precision. What the Allies needed was a shell that could think for itself, one that would detonate automatically when it sensed proximity to a target. The concept was simple. The engineering challenge was almost insurmountable. The British had already begun preliminary work on such a device, but their resources were stretched to breaking point by the demands of simply surviving the German onslaught. In September 1940, a scientific mission led by Henry Tizard arrived in Washington, carrying a black metal box containing Britain's most precious technological secrets. Inside were cavity magnetrons, jet engine designs, and the embryonic blueprints for what would become known as the proximity fuse. The Americans recognized immediately that this device, if perfected, could transform the entire nature of modern warfare. Within weeks, the National Defense Research Committee had established Section T, a top-secret research division tasked with making the impossible possible. The man chosen to lead this effort was Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution who had pioneered the use of radio waves to measure the height of the ionosphere. Tuve understood that the key to creating a proximity fuse lay in miniaturizing radio technology to fit inside the confined space of an artillery shell, while simultaneously making it robust enough to survive the violent forces of being fired from a gun. The acceleration inside a cannon barrel reaches 30,000 times the force of gravity. The temperature spikes to over 500 degrees Celsius. The rotation imparted by rifling grooves exceeds 500 revolutions per second. Any electronic device placed inside such an environment would be subjected to forces that would destroy conventional vacuum tubes in milliseconds. Tuve assembled a team of over 1,000 scientists and engineers who worked in conditions of absolute secrecy. They nicknamed their creation the Variable Time Fuse, or VT fuse, a deliberately misleading designation designed to obscure its true function. The device operated on a brilliantly simple principle. A tiny radio transmitter inside the shell continuously broadcast a signal. When that signal bounced off a nearby object and returned to the shell, a receiver detected the reflection. The Doppler shift in the reflected signal, caused by the shell's movement toward the target, triggered the detonation circuit when the shell reached optimal range, typically around 9 meters from the target. The engineering obstacles seemed endless. The vacuum tubes of the era were fragile glass constructions that shattered under the slightest shock. Tuve's team developed rugged miniature tubes using metal and ceramic construction, each one hand-tested for resilience. The batteries required to power the radio circuit had to deliver sufficient current instantly upon firing, yet remain inert during months of storage. They created a novel wet cell battery design where the electrolyte was stored in a separate glass ampule that shattered upon firing, activating the power source. The entire assembly had to fit within the nose cone of a 5-inch naval shell, a space roughly the size of a large coffee mug. By early 1943, Section T had produced working prototypes. The testing phase revealed just how effective this weapon could be. In January 1943, the cruiser USS Helena became the first warship to deploy proximity-fused shells in combat during operations in the Solomon Islands. The results exceeded all expectations. Aircraft that would have required hundreds of conventional rounds to destroy were being eliminated with single salvos. The hit rate for anti-aircraft fire jumped from less than 1% to over 50%. Japanese pilots reported that American ships seemed to have developed supernatural accuracy. In one engagement, proximity-fused shells destroyed or damaged 11 Japanese aircraft in a matter of minutes. The weapon was so effective that American commanders faced an agonizing security dilemma. The proximity fuse worked perfectly over water because unexploded shells sank to the bottom of the ocean, beyond enemy recovery. But using the weapon over land risked allowing intact fuses to fall into German or Japanese hands, potentially allowing them to reverse engineer the technology. The Joint Chiefs of Staff imposed strict restrictions. VT fuses could only be used in naval operations where there was no possibility of shells landing on territory the enemy could search. This limitation would remain in effect until December 1944, when the desperate circumstances of the Battle of the Bulge finally forced commanders to authorize land-based use. But the story of the secret shell's role at Normandy requires understanding how naval variants were adapted for an entirely different purpose than shooting down aircraft. While Section T perfected the anti-aircraft proximity fuse, naval ordnance engineers in both Britain and America were wrestling with a related problem: how to destroy the massive concrete fortifications that Germany had constructed along the Atlantic coastline. The Atlantic Wall represented the most ambitious defensive construction project in human history. Under the direction of Organization Taut, over 260,000 workers had poured millions of tons of concrete into 17,000 defensive structures, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. The bunkers protecting key positions featured walls up to 3.5 meters thick, reinforced with dense networks of steel rebar. Conventional high-explosive naval shells simply shattered against these structures, dissipating their energy in superficial cratering. The Germans had calculated, correctly based on existing technology, that their primary gun emplacements could withstand prolonged bombardment from even the largest battleship guns in the Allied fleet. Their engineers had studied the effects of naval gunfire extensively during the First World War, when the mighty guns of the Grand Fleet had proven unable to destroy German fortifications at places like Zeebrugge. The concrete formulations used in Atlantic wall construction had been specifically optimized to resist explosive shock waves, using a carefully calibrated mixture of aggregate sizes that dissipated blast energy through controlled fracturing. Theoretical models suggested that destroying a major casemate would require sustained bombardment over several days, giving defenders ample time to withdraw to secondary positions or call for reinforcements. What German engineers had not anticipated was the development of a new generation of armor-piercing shells specifically designed to defeat reinforced concrete. The American Mark 21 AP shell represented a radical departure from conventional ordnance design. Traditional naval shells achieved their effect through explosive force, detonating on or near the surface of a target and relying on blast pressure to cause damage. The Mark 21 took a different approach entirely. Its hardened steel body was designed to penetrate deep into concrete before detonating, placing the explosive charge inside the structure rather than against its surface. The physics of this approach multiplied destructive effect by an order of magnitude. When an explosive detonates against the exterior of a concrete wall, the blast wave expands spherically outward. Most of the energy dissipates into the atmosphere, with only a fraction transferred into the structure. But when the same explosive detonates inside the concrete itself, the dense material contains the blast, focusing destructive pressure inward. The result is catastrophic structural failure as the concrete essentially tears itself apart from within. The Mark 21 achieved penetration through a combination of mass, velocity, and metallurgy. At nearly 60 kilograms, fired at velocities exceeding 700 meters per second, the shell concentrated enormous kinetic energy onto a hardened ballistic cap. This cap was manufactured from specially treated chrome-nickel steel capable of withstanding initial impact without deforming. Behind it sat the main body of the shell, filled with explosive D, a proprietary mixture based on ammonium picrate that was specifically chosen for its insensitivity to shock. The timing of detonation in a penetrating shell proved almost as challenging as the proximity fuse problem. Detonate too early, and the shell bursts before achieving full penetration, wasting much of its destructive potential. Detonate too late, and the shell passes entirely through the target, exploding harmlessly on the far side. The solution required a delayed action fuse capable of withstanding the tremendous deceleration forces encountered during concrete penetration, while still triggering at precisely the right moment. American engineers developed mechanical delay fuses using calibrated resistance elements that compressed during penetration, triggering detonation after the shell had traveled a calculated distance into the target. Different delay settings allowed gunners to optimize performance against varying thicknesses of fortification. Before you continue watching, if you find this type of historical deep dive valuable, consider subscribing to support the creation of more content like this. Now let us return to the beaches of Normandy. The naval bombardment plan for Operation Overlord represented the most complex shore bombardment operation ever attempted. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers would deliver fire support across 5 invasion beaches spanning nearly 80 kilometers of coastline. The primary targets were the German gun emplacements, capable of engaging landing craft and beaches with direct fire. Intelligence officers had identified over 100 priority targets, ranging from massive casemated batteries mounting 155mm guns down to smaller resistance nests equipped with machine guns and mortars. Each target had been photographed repeatedly by reconnaissance aircraft, its construction analyzed by structural engineers, and an appropriate ammunition allocation calculated based on estimated resistance. The battleship USS Texas would play a particularly crucial role in the Omaha Beach sector. Commissioned in 1914, Texas was an aging warrior by 1944 standards, her 14-inch main guns representing technology from another era. But those same guns, firing Mark 21 armor-piercing shells, possessed the combination of projectile weight and muzzle velocity needed to defeat the heaviest German fortifications. Texas was assigned to neutralize the gun battery at Pointe du Hoc, a position that intelligence believed housed 6 155mm guns capable of engaging both Omaha and Utah beaches. The position sat atop a 30-meter cliff protected by concrete casemates and connected to underground ammunition storage by reinforced tunnels. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, Texas took her bombardment position some 7 kilometers offshore. Through the darkness, her fire control officers could see nothing of their targets, relying entirely on predetermined coordinates plotted from aerial photographs. At 5:50 in the morning, the order came to commence firing. The ship's 10 14-inch guns erupted in sequence, sending shells weighing over 680 kilograms each, screaming toward the French coastline. Each shell reached its target in approximately 11 seconds, arriving at velocities still exceeding 500 meters per second despite air resistance. The impacts sent shockwaves through the limestone cliffs that defenders felt in their bones. For the German soldiers manning Pointe du Hoc, the experience was unlike anything their training had prepared them for. Previous bombardments had been terrifying, but survivable, the explosions crashing against the exterior of their positions while they sheltered inside. These shells were different. They punched through the concrete walls as if the material were mere plaster, detonating inside the gunrooms with devastating effect. One casemate took a direct hit that penetrated the forward wall, passed through the gun emplacement, and detonated against the rear wall, collapsing the entire structure onto its gun and crew. Survivors described the sensation of the earth itself convulsing, of solid concrete fragmenting into lethal shrapnel that ricocheted through enclosed spaces, with no avenue of escape. The bombardment continued for over 2 hours before the first landing craft reached the beaches. During that time, Texas alone fired over 600 main battery rounds at her assigned targets, supported by thousands of additional shells from secondary batteries and accompanying destroyers. The cumulative effect transformed the landscape. Aerial photographs taken after the battle show the cliff top of Pointe du Hoc cratered so heavily that it resembles a moonscape, the once formidable gun positions reduced to piles of shattered concrete and twisted steel. When Army Rangers finally scaled the cliffs in one of the most celebrated small unit actions of the war, they discovered that the German defenders had already evacuated the guns to alternate positions, so severe had the bombardment been. The story at Omaha Beach itself proved more complicated and ultimately more tragic. The beach defenses there were distributed across multiple resistance nests, rather than concentrated in a few large installations, presenting a more difficult targeting problem. Dense smoke and dust from the initial bombardment obscured many positions from naval spotters. Landing craft carrying artillery observers were sunk in the heavy surf, disrupting planned fire coordination. Most critically, the decision to conduct the final bombardment at such short range to maximize accuracy meant that many shells passed over the beach entirely, impacting the bluffs beyond, rather than the firing positions engaging the landing troops. The first waves of infantry that hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning found many German positions still intact and fully operational. Machine guns opened up from camouflaged bunkers, catching soldiers as they struggled through chest-deep water toward a beach offering no cover. Within minutes, the carefully planned assault had degenerated into a desperate survival struggle. Bodies piled against the beach obstacles, the water turned crimson. Units lost all cohesion as leaders fell and communications equipment failed. For nearly 3 hours, the outcome of the entire invasion hung in precarious balance. What saved Omaha Beach was not a technological miracle, but the courage of individual destroyers and their crews who violated standing orders to come within point-blank range of the shore. Seeing the disaster unfolding, commanders of vessels like USS Frankfurt, USS McCook, and USS Thompson brought their ships so close to the beach that their hulls scraped the sandy bottom. At ranges of under 1,000 meters, they engaged individual German positions with direct fire, their gunners able to observe their targets through standard optical sights. These ships fired not the heavy armor-piercing rounds of the battleships, but high-explosive shells and proximity-fused air bursts that proved devastating against the exposed infantry defending the trench lines and communication routes connecting German strongpoints. The proximity fuse demonstrated an unexpected advantage in this close-quarters naval support role. Originally designed to detonate when approaching an aircraft, the radio-triggered mechanism worked equally well against the ground. Shells fused to burst approximately 6 meters above the surface showered lethal fragments downward over a wide area, effective against troops in open trenches or moving between positions. German soldiers attempting to reinforce or resupply their bunkers faced a rain of steel that seemed to anticipate their movements. The psychological effect was perhaps as significant as the physical casualties. Defenders who had withstood conventional bombardment for hours broke and withdrew under this new form of attack, convinced that American technology had achieved capabilities beyond human countermeasures. By early afternoon, the crisis on Omaha Beach had passed. Infantry had breached the seawall at multiple points, infiltrating behind the German defensive line and isolating individual strong points for reduction. Destroyers continued to provide close support, engaging targets of opportunity identified by shorefire control parties now established on the bluffs. The armor-piercing shells that had failed to neutralize all targets during the pre-landing bombardment proved brutally effective when fired with direct observation. One by one, the German casemates that had inflicted such terrible casualties on the morning assault were systematically destroyed. By nightfall, American forces had pushed over a kilometer inland, establishing a tenuous but viable beachhead. The performance of specialized ammunition at Normandy prompted rapid reassessment of existing doctrine and accelerated development of new variants. Naval architects began designing purpose-built fire support ships capable of delivering sustained bombardment with improved accuracy. Ammunition engineers developed enhanced concrete-piercing shells, incorporating lessons learned about optimal delay settings and explosive compositions. Most significantly, the success of proximity-fused naval shells against ground targets increased pressure to authorize their use in field artillery, a decision that would come 6 months later during the German Ardennes offensive, with equally dramatic results. The German response to the Allied shell technology evolved through several phases. Initial reports from survivors of the bombardment were often dismissed as exaggerations or evidence of psychological breakdown. Staff officers reviewing damage assessments struggled to reconcile the theoretical protection values of Atlantic Wall construction with the observed destruction. When physical evidence made denial impossible, German engineers began emergency programs to upgrade fortification standards. New bunker designs featured increased wall thickness, improved internal compartmentalization to contain damage, and innovative features like sacrificial outer layers designed to strip away the ballistic caps of penetrating shells. These countermeasures came too late to affect the outcome in France, but influenced fortification design on the Eastern Front and within Germany itself. The massive flak towers constructed in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna during late 1944 incorporated lessons from Normandy, featuring walls up to 3.5 meters thick with internal honeycombing to dissipate penetration energy. Whether these structures would have withstood prolonged naval bombardment remained untested as the war concluded before Allied ships could engage them. Post-war analysis suggested that even these enhanced fortifications would have been vulnerable to the next generation of penetrating munitions then under development. The human dimension of these technological developments deserves consideration alongside the tactical analysis. Inside those concrete bunkers were young men, most of them conscripts, many of them teenagers pressed into service as Germany's manpower reserves depleted. They had been assured that their positions were impervious to attack, that the engineering genius of the Reich had created defenses worthy of their sacrifice. When shells began punching through walls they had been told were invulnerable, the psychological shock compounded the physical danger. Survivors described the sensation of betrayal, of having been lied to by commanders who must have known the true vulnerability of their positions. Klaus Richter, the artilleryman introduced at the beginning of this account, was among those who did not survive the bombardment of Widerstandsnest 62. His position took a direct hit from a 14-inch shell during the initial bombardment. The shell penetrated the forward casemate wall, passed through the gun room where Richter and his crew were preparing their weapon for action, and detonated against the ammunition storage area at the rear of the position. The resulting secondary explosions collapsed the entire structure. His body was recovered by American Graves registration units several days after the battle and buried in the German military cemetery at Lecombe, one of over 21,000 German soldiers interred there. He was 22 years old. The American casualties on Omaha Beach, where defensive positions survived the bombardment most effectively, numbered approximately 2,000 in the first day alone. Many of these losses might have been prevented had the pre-landing bombardment been more effective or the proximity fuse authorized for land use earlier. This counterfactual haunted some of the scientists who developed these weapons. Merle Tuve, in particular, struggled with questions of whether faster development or different deployment decisions might have saved lives. In his post-war writings, he reflected on the moral complexity of weapons research, the knowledge that every day of delay in perfecting a defensive weapon potentially cost lives, while simultaneously understanding that offensive applications of the same technology multiplied death on the other side. The proximity fuse would ultimately be rated by historians as one of the three most significant technological developments of the Second World War, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Its influence extended far beyond the beaches of Normandy. In the Pacific Theater, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells broke the back of Japanese kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign. Against conventional aircraft, hit rates exceeding 20 times those achieved with mechanical fuses made suicide tactics the only viable option for Japanese forces seeking to inflict significant naval losses. In the European theater, proximity-fused artillery shells fired against German formations in the Ardennes inflicted casualties so severe that surviving soldiers refused to believe the weapons were conventional munitions, convinced instead that the Americans had deployed some form of poison gas or radiological weapon. The technological lineage of the proximity fuse continues into the present day. Modern smart munitions, from laser-guided bombs to GPS-directed artillery shells, represent evolutionary developments of the same fundamental concept: weapons that sense their environment and adjust their behavior accordingly. The miniaturized electronics that made the VT fuse possible drove subsequent developments in transistor technology and integrated circuits. Some historians argue that the proximity fuse project represented the true beginning of the electronics revolution, predating by several years the more celebrated work at Bell Laboratories that produced the transistor. The concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall still stand along the French coast, silent monuments to a defensive concept rendered obsolete in a single morning. Tourists visiting the Normandy beaches can explore these structures, running their hands along walls, still bearing the impact scars of naval shells fired 8 decades ago. At Pointe du Hoc, the cratered landscape remains largely unchanged, preserved as a memorial to the rangers who scaled those cliffs and the naval gunners who made their ascent possible. The largest shell craters, some exceeding 15 meters in diameter, testify to the devastating power of weapons specifically designed to defeat fortifications their builders considered impregnable. If this documentary has illuminated aspects of the Second World War you had not previously considered, please support this channel by subscribing and sharing this content with others interested in military history. Your engagement makes continued production of these detailed historical examinations possible. The story of the secret shell that made Normandy bunkers helpless represents more than a technological achievement. It demonstrates the fundamental asymmetry between offense and defense in modern warfare, the reality that any fortification, no matter how massive or cleverly designed, will eventually be defeated by weapons specifically engineered to breach it. The German Atlantic Wall consumed enormous resources that might have been allocated to mobile reserves or aircraft production. The concrete and steel poured into bunkers along the coast could have built tanks and artillery pieces capable of counterattacking the invasion forces once they came ashore. Strategic analysis suggests that a more mobile defensive posture might have posed greater challenges to the Allied landings than the static fortifications that were ultimately bypassed or destroyed. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners. The great fortification projects of the Cold War era, from the NATO-hardened aircraft shelters to the Soviet nuclear bunkers beneath the Ural Mountains, were designed with the understanding that penetrating munitions would continue to evolve. Defense became a matter of redundancy and dispersal rather than concentration and strength. The expectation was that any single position could be destroyed, but that spreading critical assets across multiple hardened locations would ensure survival of sufficient capability for retaliation or continued operations. The proximity fuse and its penetrating shell companions had not merely breached the Atlantic Wall. They had fundamentally changed how military architects thought about protection. The veterans who served in the naval bombardment forces at Normandy carried varied memories of their experience. Gunners aboard the battleships and cruisers described the physical sensations of sustained firing, the deck plates heaving beneath their feet with each salvo, the acrid smell of propellant gases, the ear-splitting concussions that left some with permanent hearing damage despite protective equipment. Fire control officers recall the frustration of engaging targets they could barely see through smoke and morning haze, the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether their shells were finding their marks or sailing harmlessly overhead. Commanders remember the agonized decisions about ammunition expenditure, the knowledge that each shell fired against a fortification was one less available for potential naval engagements if German surface forces sortied against the invasion fleet. The destroyer crews who closed to point-blank range during the crisis on Omaha Beach carry the most intense recollections. At distances where they could see individual German soldiers manning their positions, the combat became personal in a way that long-range naval gunnery typically avoids. Several survivors described making eye contact with enemy soldiers in the moments before their guns fired. The engagement was so close that shell flight time was measured in fractions of a second, allowing German machine gunners to track incoming fire as they might track a thrown stone. One destroyer took over 20 hits from German artillery and small arms during her close support mission, her hull plating perforated in dozens of locations, her upper works shredded by shrapnel. She lost 11 sailors eliminated during the engagement and another 23 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. These personal costs remind us that behind every technological triumph stand human beings who developed, deployed, and sometimes perished because of these innovations. The scientists who created the proximity fuse worked under conditions of intense pressure and secrecy for 3 years, many of them sacrificing personal relationships and health in pursuit of a weapon they believed would save Allied lives. The sailors who fired the shells faced risks ranging from accidental magazine detonations to enemy action, knowing that their floating platforms of steel and explosive were themselves vulnerable to the same technologies they deployed against shore targets. The German defenders, whatever their individual feelings about National Socialist ideology, were young men placed in positions of extraordinary danger by political decisions far beyond their control. The ethical dimensions of weapons development during total war continue to generate scholarly debate. Those who developed penetrating shells and proximity fuses believed they were shortening the conflict and reducing overall casualties by accelerating Allied victory. Critics argue that technologies designed to kill more efficiently inevitably produce moral corrosion in those who create and deploy them. The same scientists who developed the proximity fuse moved into atomic weapons research after the war, some becoming vigorous advocates for nuclear disarmament once they understood the apocalyptic potential of the technologies they had helped create. Merle Tuve himself became active in arms control advocacy during the 1950s, arguing that the only sane response to advanced weapons technology was international cooperation to prevent their use. The Normandy landings succeeded not because of any single weapon system, but through the combined effects of air superiority, naval firepower, logistical preparation, and the courage of individual soldiers who continued advancing despite casualties that would have broken less determined forces. The secret shell and its proximity-fused companions played important roles in this success, but their contribution must be understood within the broader context of a military operation involving over 150,000 personnel on the first day alone. Technology enabled, but did not determine the outcome. Human will, organizational capacity, and strategic judgment remained decisive factors. 80 years after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy remain places of pilgrimage for veterans, their families, and students of history. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer contains nearly 10,000 graves, each marked with identical white crosses or stars of David aligned in perfect rows overlooking the beach where so many fell. The German cemetery at Le Camp holds its dead in darker granite, the markers grouped in clusters that reflect the chaos of wartime burial. Both cemeteries stand as testament to the price of that single day, a price paid by young men who, in another time, might have been friends rather than enemies, students rather than soldiers, creators rather than destroyers. The technology that helped breach the Atlantic Wall continues evolving in laboratories and proving grounds around the world. Modern penetrating munitions incorporate guidance systems that would have seemed miraculous to the engineers of 1944. Material science has produced warhead casings capable of surviving impacts that would have shattered the chrome-nickel steel of Mark 21 shells. Computing power allows real-time adjustment of detonation timing based on sensor feedback during penetration. These developments ensure that the fundamental insight discovered at Normandy remains valid. No static fortification can provide permanent protection against adversaries committed to its destruction. The secret that made Normandy bunkers helpless was not truly a single weapon, but a new philosophy of warfare, the understanding that modern industrial societies could apply scientific method to the systematic defeat of defensive systems. The proximity fuse and penetrating shells represented this philosophy, made concrete, literal embodiments of the proposition that engineering could solve tactical problems previously considered intractable. This approach would define military technology development for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st, producing weapons of ever-increasing precision and lethality. Whether this trajectory represents progress or catastrophe depends largely on one's position relative to the targets. For those of us studying these events from the safety of historical distance, the story of the secret shell offers lessons that transcend its immediate military context. It demonstrates the pace at which determined organizations can solve complex technical problems when sufficiently motivated. It reveals the way warfare drives innovation in areas far beyond immediate military application. It reminds us that behind every decisive battle lie years of preparation, failed experiments, incremental improvements, and dedicated effort by individuals whose names rarely appear in historical accounts. Most importantly, it shows that no defensive position is truly impregnable, that every wall can be breached given sufficient determination and ingenuity. The German soldiers who manned the Atlantic Wall believed they were protected by the most advanced fortification technology of their era. They were correct in that assessment. What they did not anticipate, what no one can anticipate, is the pace at which offensive capabilities evolved to match and exceed defensive measures. The concrete bunkers of Normandy represented the culmination of centuries of fortification design, the final expression of a defensive philosophy dating back to medieval castle builders. In a single morning, shells carrying technology those castle builders could not have imagined rendered that philosophy obsolete. The soldiers inside never saw it coming. This pattern repeats throughout military history and will undoubtedly continue into futures we cannot yet envision. Walls are built. Weapons are developed to breach them. Stronger walls are built. More powerful weapons emerge. The cycle continues indefinitely, constrained only by the resources societies are willing to commit to the enterprise of organized violence. Understanding this pattern helps us comprehend not only the past, but the likely trajectory of future conflicts, where technological surprise will remain as decisive as it proved on the morning of June 6, 1944. The beaches are quiet now. The bunkers crumble slowly under the assault of salt air and time. Tourists photograph the monuments and read the plaques, attempting to summarize in a few words events that shaped the modern world. Below the bluffs where so many died, French families spread blankets on sand that was once crimson with blood. Children build castles of the same earth that swallowed American artillery shells fired from offshore. The waves that carried landing craft now carry surfers and sailboats. The transformation seems complete, the violence of that morning reduced to museum exhibits and memorial speeches. But the knowledge persists. The physics of penetrating munitions remain valid. The electronics principles that made the proximity fuse possible have evolved into technologies that surround us invisibly in our daily lives. The organizational methods that enabled rapid weapons development during wartime were adopted by civilian industry after the conflict, shaping the research and development practices of corporations worldwide. The strategic lessons about fortification vulnerability continue to influence military planning and defense ministries around the globe. The secret shell that made Normandy bunkers helpless was not buried with those who fired it or those who died beneath its impact. It lives on in every smart weapon, every precision munition, every guided projectile that traces its technological ancestry back to those desperate years of innovation. For the soldiers who landed under fire on June 6, 1944, technological considerations were largely abstract. They cared only whether the bunkers shooting at them would be silenced and whether they would survive to see the sun set on liberated France. The shells that answered their need were products of scientific institutions most of them had never heard of, manufactured in factories they would never visit, fired by sailors they would never meet. This disconnection between those who develop weapons and those who benefit from their effects characterizes modern warfare in ways that distinguish it fundamentally from earlier eras. The knight who forged his own sword understood intimately the weapon he carried into battle. The infantryman supported by naval gunfire understood only that explosions occurred in places that had been trying to eliminate him, that he survived because someone somewhere had created tools equal to the task of his protection. That anonymous dependence on distant technology has only increased in the decades since Normandy. Modern soldiers rely on satellite navigation, encrypted communications, precision-guided munitions, and countless other systems developed by specialists they will never encounter. This dependence creates both capability and vulnerability. Forces equipped with advanced technology achieve results that would have seemed miraculous to their predecessors. But when that technology fails, or is countered by adversary innovations, the resulting dysfunction can prove catastrophic. The soldiers pinned down on Omaha Beach experienced such a failure when smoke and targeting errors prevented naval gunfire from neutralizing defensive positions. Only the improvised response of destroyer crews willing to accept extreme risk restored the balance. This interplay between technology and human judgment, between systems and souls, defines the essential character of modern military operations. The secret shell that made Normandy bunkers helpless was a product of both. The culmination of scientific understanding and engineering skill, married to the courage of sailors willing to deliver fire under conditions of extreme danger. Neither element alone would have sufficed. The most advanced munitions in the world are useless without crews trained and willing to employ them. The bravest fighters achieve little if their weapons cannot defeat enemy defenses. Victory at Normandy required both, as victory in any serious conflict requires the integration of human and technological capabilities into coherent fighting systems. The legacy of June 6, 1944, extends far beyond the beaches where the fighting occurred. It shaped the post-war world order, ensured that Western Europe would be rebuilt under democratic rather than totalitarian governance, and established the military relationships that would define the Cold War and beyond. None of this was guaranteed on that morning when the first landing craft approached shores bristling with German defenses. The outcome depended on countless factors, from strategic planning conducted in London and Washington to individual acts of courage performed by soldiers whose names are largely forgotten. Among those factors, the secret shell and its capacity to breach fortifications previously considered impregnable played a role whose importance became clear only through the historical analysis that followed. The bunkers still stand along the Normandy coast, their concrete slowly weathering under assault by elements far less violent than those they were designed to resist. Inside their dim chambers, visitors can still see the marks left by shells fired from ships long since scrapped. These scars tell a story of technological competition, of defensive measures met and defeated by offensive innovation, of the eternal military struggle between protection and penetration. They remind us that security is always provisional, that today's impregnable fortress is tomorrow's archaeological ruin. Most importantly, they honor the memory of those who fought and perished on both sides of those concrete walls, young men whose lives were shaped and often ended by technologies they neither understood nor controlled. The secret is no longer secret. The physics of the proximity fuse are taught in undergraduate engineering courses. The metallurgy of penetrating shells appears in open technical literature. The tactics employed at Normandy are studied at military academies worldwide. But the fundamental surprise remains possible because the cycle of innovation never stops. Somewhere today, engineers are developing weapons that will render current defensive systems obsolete. Somewhere today, other engineers are designing protections against threats not yet deployed. The competition continues as it has since the first human picked up a stone and threw it at an enemy. The secret shell that made Normandy bunkers helpless was one moment in this endless contest, one breakthrough in a series stretching backward to prehistory and forward to futures we cannot imagine. For those who study military history, understanding this dynamic offers perspective unavailable through any other discipline. It reveals the pace of change, the consequences of technological surprise, the importance of sustained investment in research and development. It demonstrates that complacency kills, that assuming current capabilities will remain adequate courts disaster. Most importantly, it shows that human ingenuity, when properly directed and resourced, can solve problems that seem impossible. The scientists who created the proximity fuse were told repeatedly that their goals were unachievable. They achieved them anyway. The shells they produced helped breach a wall that Germany believed was impenetrable. The lesson applies far beyond military affairs. Never assume that any problem is beyond solution, that any barrier is truly permanent. The waves continue to wash the sands of Normandy, smoothing away the last traces of that violent morning. The concrete bunkers continue their slow decay. The cemeteries continue to receive visitors who come to pay respects to the fallen. And somewhere in laboratories and factories around the world, the work continues that will produce the weapons of future conflicts, the secret shells that will make future fortifications helpless. The cycle spins on, driven by human creativity, human fear, and human determination to overcome whatever obstacles adversaries place in the path to victory. This was the lesson of Normandy. It remains the lesson today. June 6, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness over the English Channel vibrates with the rumble of 14,000 vessels. Inside the reinforced concrete walls of Widerstandsnest 62, a German artilleryman named Klaus Richter peers through the narrow observation slit of his bunker overlooking what the Allies have codenamed Omaha Beach.